Hello my friends and welcome back to Meerkat Musings. Welcome to the first post, or first video I should say, on the subject of the 2024 Formula One season, which starts this weekend with the slightly unusual feature of a Saturday race because of Ramadan over in Bahrain, and this will be repeated at the following weekend's event in Saudi Arabia. So we've had Thursday practice, Friday qualifying, and a Saturday race, which is a bit of a novelty. And this does mean that I will miss the race because although I happen to be off on Sunday, well, I'm working Saturday. So there we go. No race for me, unfortunately. That's slightly disappointing, but hey-ho, I'll have opportunities to catch races and, of course, catch the highlights, and I'll be able to offer my thoughts and feelings on the events of the unfolding season. But one thing looks immediately clear from qualifying for the first race. Red Bull are going to be very, very hard to stop. Well, when I say Red Bull, I mean specifically Max Verstappen. He has obviously been very dominant over the last few years, particularly the last couple of years, where Red Bull have really nailed down the concept of these ground effect downforce cars and nailed them down far better than any other team. Last year they won all but one race, and you could argue a case for that happening again this time around. In the first set of qualifying, well, it's interesting actually. I mean, we say that Verstappen was significantly faster than everyone else. I mean, I suppose he wasn't really in some ways. I mean, he was over 0.2 of a second faster in Q3 than the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc. So it wasn't actually a crushing margin, you could say, but it's enough, of course, to get across that line, and you expect that the race pace of the Red Bull will be very, very good. Max will be undoubtedly the team leader because his teammate Sergio Perez just doesn't have it in him to match the pace of Verstappen, which sounds harsh, but there's no denying it. I mean, last season was a very thorough demonstration of that, as was the season before, really. I like Perez as a racing driver. I think he's reliable, but he's nowhere near the pace of Max, which, to be fair, it was always going to be very, very difficult for anyone to match the performances of Max in a car you could argue is almost tailored to his needs, really. So Max out on pole, and you would expect him to do what he's done over the last few years and get away and just streak off into the distance, really. The discussions will revolve around what happens behind him. Only 0.3 of a second separated the qualifiers in Q3 from P2 to P9. And we have a mixture of cars here. We have Ferraris, Mercedes, a Red Bull, an Aston Martin and McLarens, all kind of thrown into that mix. And we did see in Q2 other teams producing comparable performances. We saw the Racing Bulls, which are the new names for the AlphaTauris, put in some lap times which kind of weren't too bad. So we could have some moments maybe where some of the midfield teams do kind of push some of the top teams a little bit. So I think if you look beyond the obvious with this season, and we look beyond the performances of Max Verstappen, I think what we'll have is an interesting and fairly close season between most of the other drivers that are in the top teams. So we'll see Mercedes and Ferrari, possibly McLaren, vying for second in the championship. And we'll see the Aston Martins, the Aston Martin of Fernando Alonso, maybe not too far behind, and who knows what surprises might come up. But at this point, I'm going to be absolutely astonished if anyone realistically can get close to Max. I would love to be wrong, because I'd love to see a competitive and interesting title fight this season. but I really don't think that we're going to get that. I think that there is more to come from this Red Bull. They're a team that know the ins and outs of ground effect downforce, and of someone like Adrian Newey designing the cars. They have probably the best designer in F1. They'll upgrade their car as the season wears on, and that should scare a lot of people because they've already spent most of last season developing this car. They switched their focus to 2024 when it became abundantly clear that no one was going to get anywhere near them in 2023. So they've had plenty of time to develop this concept, and they will only develop it further now it's being raced in anger. Now they can have a very clear picture of how it handles, they can get driver feedback, and they can absolutely push on from here. So it's coming down realistically to who might wind up being runners-up, which, does sound a bit sad and depressing, but I don't really know where else this goes. It's very hard to imagine anyone keeping up to Max's Red Bull, including his teammate Sergio. So we have to look elsewhere for entertainment, and I think there could be some of it in the form of how Mercedes and Ferrari push each other. Interesting with that, of course, in mind, to see how hard Lewis pushes in his last season at Mercedes. Bear in mind, he's going to Ferrari. What would happen if, say, his performances for Mercedes take them to second in the standings and they get extra prize money that Ferrari get deprived of because of Lewis's performances in the Mercedes? Or does he... Not that I think he would do this, but does he sabotage Mercedes from within to make sure his new team have more money to play with next season? Food for thought potentially as the season drags on, if it's close, is where do people's minds go in those circumstances? So something to consider, something to ponder perhaps. But that could be quite interesting. It'll be interesting to see what Carlos Sainz does in his last season at Ferrari. Will he be particularly motivated to kind of show why perhaps he should be the one staying rather than Charles Leclerc? I think when you look at their overall performances, Sainz and Leclerc are actually quite similar in terms of performance and points. Sainz has held his own with Leclerc in their time as teammates, but Leclerc's the one who seems to have the perceived X factor, even though he hasn't really quite lived up to that billing. Now, granted, it's difficult to live up to that billing in a car which hasn't been particularly competitive. But, between the two of them, you do kind of have to think maybe, just maybe, Sainz is more consistent. I don't know. I'm just spitballing thoughts here. And you look at, elsewhere, you've got two quite young drivers at McLaren in the form of Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. They had some good tussles last season. I think they're both quite ambitious drivers. Norris has been touted as a star of the future. I'm not 100% sold on that, to be fair, just as I'm not necessarily 100% sold on George Russell at this point for being stars of the future. But I think that people wiser and smarter than me in the field of Formula One do see something in them, which is why they are where they're at. And I think Piastri, he's only had one full season in F1, so of course he has time to learn and to grow, and I'm sure he will. It adds up to some possibly quite fascinating circumstances as the season wears on. But for the first race, barring some kind of mechanical failure or a mistake, we're going to see Max winning the race, and the fight for second, that could be quite up in the air because there's quite a few very talented drivers in cars of comparable performance who all have a point to prove. So it may yet be quite a tight tussle between some of these guys as we zip around the first race of the season. So keep an eye out on that, of course. and we'll take it from there, really. We'll hopefully have a good race, a clean race, full of entertainment, maybe a surprise or two, and we'll see how this begins to set the tone for the longest season in Formula 1 history, 24 races. So I might be doing quite a few of these videos, you never know. Anyway, I'll leave you all to it for now. We'll see how the race pans out. Hopefully enjoy it. Bye-bye.